Why does everybody hate change? Just a question I've been thinking about. I went through a big change recently. Why does everybody hate change? The ancient Greek philosopher from Ephesus, Heraclitus, said he theorized that everything was change, that all of reality was change. It was flux. Everything was in a state of flux all the time. Emotions, physical realities, spiritual, immaterial reality, everything was in a state of change and flux all the time. And he theorized that it looks like we look at things in a moment and see them as stable, but actually we're just glimpsing things in one moment of its process of change. And we view it as stable, but we're watching things in any stable moment just transitioning from one thing to the next. Heraclitus said this: there is nothing permanent except change. If change is so ubiquitous in the world and in our lives and maybe in all of reality, why do we fight so hard to avoid change? It seems like a bit of a fool's errand, doesn't it? If we all just sort of admit that change is a part of reality, why are we pushing so hard all the time against change in our life, in our world, in our society? Why are we fighting change if it's so ubiquitous? We may have a couple answers and thoughts about this. Maybe it's the inconvenience of change. Change is so inconvenient. God, it's terribly inconvenient to have to go through change. Maybe it's the cost associated with change. Change is costly. But are these reasons really effective? Are these reasons really pertinent and weighty? If our reasons for avoiding change are all about the frustration that change brings in our lives, we maybe need to ask at some point, like, how might our lives be frustrated by an inability to change? If we hate change because of the way it frustrates our lives, maybe we need to think more deeply about how our lives are frustrated by our inability to change. In other words, if we think that change is inconvenient, let's ask the question, in what ways will our lives be inconvenienced by our inability to change? If we think that change is costly, let's ask the question, in what ways will we pay costs in our lives for being unable to change? C.S. Lewis said this about the necessity of change in our lives: it may be hard for an egg to turn into a bird. It would be a jolly sight harder for an egg to learn to fly while remaining an egg. We are like eggs at present, and you cannot go on indefinitely just being an ordinary, decent egg. We must be hatched or go bad. Why do we hate change? Why do we need to change? And how can we change in our lives? These are some of the questions that we're going to be asking today. I've titled today's sermon, I Don't Want to Change. We are in the middle of a sermon series called I Don't Want to Grow Up, where we are looking at the book of Jonah for lessons on spiritual maturity and growth in our lives so that God help us, we can finally grow up. We can finally stop just circling around our cycles of immaturity forever in our lives, and we can grow up and become spiritual adults, like weight-bearing spiritual adults that other people can lean on and rely on, and that's why we are reading the book of Jonah right now. And we've sort of been in three movements in the sermon series. In the first movement, the first chapter, we looked at the basic core elements of immaturity, like the things, the cycle of immaturity itself as it exists. And the second chapter, the second movement of the sermon series, Clint walked us through the ways in which God saves us, gives us second chances, and delivers us out of our immaturity. And now we're in the sort of third and final section of the sermon series in chapter 3 and 4, where we're looking through the life of Jonah at the way in which we don't just act in an immature way, we don't just experience God's deliverance from immaturity, but in response to that deliverance, we somehow choose immaturity again and live as chronically immature people. And that's what we're looking at in these next couple weeks. We actually sort of get a wonderful little moment today where we get to see an example of some spiritual maturity, people who are able to change, and the repentance of the Ninevites. That's what we're going to be looking at today. We're going to be in Jonah chapter 3, verses 6 to 10. I'd encourage you to flip there in a Bible. We have Bibles over there. Yeah, they're in a little pile behind Clint. If you don't have a Bible, you can grab one. If you don't, like capital H, have a Bible, you can grab that and keep it, and it can be yours. We're in Jonah chapter 3, verses 6 to 10. You can also pull out a device and pull it up. Jonah's in the Minor Prophets. If you're holding up your Bible, I don't know, I bet you flip, 2/3 the way through, and you'll be close to Jonah. You're in those books in the Old Testament where the pages flip really quickly because they're really short. Jonah's, short, 4 chapters. Find it. Jonah chapter 3, verses 6 through 10. I'll read the text aloud. The word reached the king of Nineveh, and he arose from his throne, removed his robe, covered himself with sackcloth, and sat in ashes. And he issued a proclamation and published throughout Nineveh, by the decree of the king and his nobles, let neither man nor beast, herd nor flock, taste anything. Let them not feed or drink water, but let man and beast be covered with sackcloth, and let them call out mightily to God. Let everyone turn from his evil way and from the violence that is in his hands. Who knows? God may turn and relent and turn from his fierce anger so that we may not perish. When God saw what they did, how they turned from their evil way, God relented of the disaster that he said he would do to them, and he did not do it. We need to be able to change. In our lives, we need to be able to change, and we often avoid change in our lives at all costs. Now, sometimes we don't necessarily need to change. Changing in itself isn't necessarily a virtue. It depends what we're changing from and what we're changing into. So just generally, sure, we don't need to change. Sometimes we avoid change in ways that just inconvenience us in our lives. Sometimes we avoid change and it's just unwise. It's like not a huge thing, but it's kind of unwise. Like, I don't know, you stayed in a job just a little too long. Like 6 months, 6 months back there, you realize that job wasn't a great job for you anymore. And you're like, I don't know. I don't really want to go through the change. I don't want to go through the process. I don't want to apply. I don't want to do any of that stuff. And you just stay, and it's just a little too long. And you feel it, and you're like, well, gosh, it would have been helpful if I could have changed earlier. But it's not devastating that you didn't do that. Or maybe like society is changing in some incrementally unimportant way, and you're like a resistor. You're not an early adopter. You're like resisting it. Like if you still use the Metro card instead of, the Omni taps to get into the subway. And then when you go to refill your Metro card on the thing, and the MTA, like 1 out of 10 times charges you double for refilling your Metro card, and then you can never get reimbursed because the reimbursement process is absolutely insane. That's your fault that you did that, because that wouldn't happen with Omni. And that definitely doesn't happen to me, but it might happen to some of you. That might be the story of some of you. Like out there, you're just holding on to that Metro card for dear life. I don't know. That's probably something you do. And so sometimes, change, it's not a virtue. You don't necessarily have to change. Sometimes you avoid change and it's just unwise. But sometimes we are in situations in our life where the need to change is utterly urgent and important. And if we cannot change in some situation or some relationship or some employment opportunity, whatever it is, if we cannot find the way to change, we have doom and destruction and being overthrown waiting for us. Sometimes it is utterly essential to be able to change. And in those situations, we need to be able to change right now. This is the situation that the Ninevites were in, because I'm sure you remember from last week, Jonah prophesied to them in chapter 3, verse 4, when he went through the city about a day's journey, he said, "Yet 40 days in Nineveh shall be overthrown." This is an utterly serious and urgent situation. And it's urgent for 2 reasons. The situation is time sensitive. There's a ticking clock, 40 days. And at the end of the ticking clock, there's a second thing that's going to happen, namely destruction. And a dire consequence mixed with a ticking clock creates a situation in which we need to be able to change right now. The Ninevites were in this sort of situation, and we find ourselves in these sorts of situations as well. Maybe we're in these situations sometimes with our finances. We've had unwise financial habits for some significant period of time, and all of a sudden we're looking at it and we're going, you know what, if I continue this pattern any longer, I'm going to set myself up for a life of financial burden. And I need to turn that around right now and find a way to change. Maybe it's in like a situation with physical health. Like a moment, I don't know if any of you have ever had a moment where you walk into the doctor and the doctor goes, listen, we've had this conversation a number of times now. You have now got to stop that. That thing that you're doing, we're now talking about like the number of years it's shaving off your life. We're talking about the number of years you have left to live. And we had all these polite conversations where I was like, drink more water, and you sort of listened to me. But now we're at the place where I'm telling you there is a dire consequence on a ticking clock, and you need to change right now. Maybe you've experienced something like this in a relationship, because of course it's just a cruel reality of life that we often give the worst parts of ourselves to the people that we are the most intimate with. And we recycle just our biggest character flaws and our most destructive patterns. And over time, relationships can't bear those burdens indefinitely. And at some point, if we can't find a way to change and bring a different part of ourselves to a relationship, a friendship, a dating relationship, a marriage, that relationship is on a ticking clock. In these situations, we need to be able to change, and we need to be able to change now. The Ninevites were in this sort of a situation, and they were able to change. They turned around and changed immediately. This is verse 6 of chapter 3. The word reached the king. The word of 40 days and Nineveh will be overthrown. The word reached the king, and he arose from his throne, removed his robe, covered himself with sackcloth, and sat down in ashes. The king changed immediately, and all of Nineveh ended up changing with him. And they changed in two ways. They changed immediately in their actions, and they changed in their appearance. The king went from sitting on a throne to sitting on ashes. He changed what he was doing. His actions previously said, I am some regal, important, kingly person, but he changed his actions to now say, I am a humble, destitute, impoverished person. He changed what he was doing. The people also changed what they were doing. They didn't change from sitting on a throne to sitting on ashes. They changed from eating to not eating. They said, we are going to change what we do in response to the situation. They also changed their appearance. The king took off his garments, probably some sort of a regal royal robe, and instead put on sackcloth, the clothes of mourning. In other words, what the king and the Ninevites said is, this bad situation that's coming on this ticking clock, it necessitates that we can no longer go forward in the way that we have been going. And we must change right now what we're doing and how we appear about what we're doing. And so they changed. They changed immediately. And this is what we need in our lives. In certain moments, not every moment, but certain moments, it is time to change, and it's time to change right now. We reach moments in our life where we cannot keep going the way that we have. And if we do, we will endure dramatic loss. We must change our actions and our appearance. We must show up in that situation in an entirely different way. And some of us are in a moment like this right now. We've seen a situation clearly. We've seen how high the cost will be if we can't change. And this has been going on for a while now. The clock is ticking. And so armed with clarity and urgency, it's time for you to change. So do it. We all agree it's important. It's urgent. The clock is... So change. Change. Just figure out a way to get it done. And as I'm saying this, of course, you're going, but it isn't that easy. If we knew how to change, we would just do it. We would just get it done. We'd say, sure, I will find a way to change that thing about myself. But somehow, changing is incredibly difficult. It turns out somehow that adding together even clarity plus conviction plus urgency doesn't even reliably add up to something that will give us the power to change. If the ability to change is so important, why can't we do it reliably, and why isn't it so hard? We need to be able to change, but change is incredibly hard. Why is change so hard? There could be a number of answers to this question, why change is difficult. Maybe they stack on each other in different ways. A leads to B, and B leads to C. I think one reason that change is so hard is because change is totally destabilizing. Change is the pulling of the rug out from under whatever we thought we were building or standing on. Change is the letting go of control over the plans that we had and the machinations that we were unfolding. Change is the pain of losing something that was valuable to you or that you were pursuing that was meaningful. Pain is scary. Pain is fear. Change is fear of stepping into the unknown. Change is difficult because it is totally and utterly destabilizing and upending in our lives. And in the face of this challenge, we need things that come into the difficulty of change and say, this thing will help you change. Because it's so hard, it's so difficult, it's so destabilizing, it's so disorienting, we need help to change. And one thing that is often very helpful when we set out to change is being able to change with other people. Being able to change in a group that's changing. We're changing together. Working together in changing is often very helpful in changing. And this is part of why the Ninevites had so much power to change. They all changed together. This is what 7 and 8 says, this decree that the king sent out. He issued a proclamation by the decree of the king and his nobles. Already the king had some help from some great ones around him, some nobles who were sending out the proclamation with him. Let neither man nor beast, herd nor flock taste anything. Let them not feed or drink water, but let man and beast be covered with sackcloth, and let them call out mightily to God. Let everyone turn from his evil way. The Ninevites had power to change in part because they changed together. Everyone in Nineveh was invited into the change. Even the animals were invited into the change, which is insane to think about. That it wouldn't matter if the animals are invited. But you've got to have this picture. They've got their animals, their herds out in the field, and they're putting sackcloth on the animals. They're like, even the animals are, but everyone is going around saying, we need to change right now, and they're all doing it together. The Ninevites are very fortunate that cats were not the major livestock that they were raising, because, my God, putting clothes on cats. I mean, I can't imagine. That would truly be exemplary. If even the Ninevite cats were wearing sackcloth, my God, putting clothes on cats. But, cattle are there, and they're like, sure, whatever, throw sackcloth over me. But cats, thank God. I mean, the story would have been totally different if it were cats instead of cattle. Changing with other people is helpful to change. And so you should be in community with other people who are trying to change in the same way. You should be in a small group. You should have transparent friendships. You should be in an intellectual community where you're taking in ideas that are the water of life that will help your mind change into a good and pure and holy place. You need to surround yourself with people who will help you change, where you're all moving and changing in the same direction. And so maybe this is the secret to change. We change in community. We change with other people. And that's partially true, but there's a problem. The world almost never works the way that it worked here in Jonah chapter 3. The thing where everyone gets together and decides we're all going to change together, and we're on the same team, and we're all doing this costly thing together, that is just generally not how the world works. Generally, the world stays the same together. But people who try to push for change, those people are often on their own. And the changes that you make in your life, especially the changes that are the most important, like moral changes or spiritual changes in your life, where you change from a selfish person to an unselfish person, where you change from a bad person to a good person, where you change from a lying person to a truthful person, those changes almost always happen in your life against the grain of everybody else. It's wonderful to imagine, and sometimes we see, hopefully in church, maybe in friend groups, maybe in other places where you find community, we find places where we change in community with people. But generally, the most important changes in your life, you will do alone. You'll do on your own. Because the crowd is not a place that helps you change virtuously. The crowd is a place that helps you stay in your own same old crap. Exodus 23:2 says, do not follow the crowd in doing wrong. It doesn't say, join the crowd and they'll help you actualize all the best changes in your life. It says the crowd is a place that will lead you to places you do not want to grow. Do not follow the crowd in doing wrong. Change, the most important changes in our lives, are particularly difficult because they almost always happen alone. Real change, profound change, is lonely. It's a lonely road to walk. Changing those financial habits is lonely. Because when you go to your friend group and say, hey, I had an idea. Let's all be more wise in our finances. Let's all spend less money. And so maybe we'll go out a little bit less, or maybe we can travel to some obscure free places and do free stuff. Why don't we just all do that? Because I'm trying to do that in my own life. Let's just be honest. What's your friend group going to say? They're going to say no. We're so for you. Oh my gosh, we're so for you. This is a great change in your life. We're so for you while we're basically telling you to do it on your own. And so changing those habits is going to be lonely and difficult because no one's going to come with you. Changing towards physically healthier habits in our lives. It's lonely. It's difficult. The world is always in its flesh and in its inability to control its desires. The world is always going to be offering you some new, immediate way to be unhealthy in your body. It's never going to stop. That's never going to change. And if you're looking around waiting for like a new glorious culture where everyone cares about health all the time, it's never coming. You are always going to fight against a world that is offering you some new bad thing for you to do for yourself. In a relationship, especially a marriage, saying, I'll only change if and when you change, well, that is a recipe for relational disaster. The most important changes that we make in our life, we make often alone. And in particular, we won't have the strength to make them unless we set out knowing that we're probably going to be alone. That I will resolve to change in this area regardless if anyone else comes with me. If we don't have that kind of clarity and conviction, we almost certainly will not have the power to change. And so we can't rely on others to give us strength to change. Not in the most important changes in our lives. And if we can't rely on that, where else can strength to change come from? Before the Ninevites changed together, where did the king of the Ninevites, this one individual, where did he get strength to change alone? Where did he get the strength to be the first person to change? Where did he get that strength from? Jonah chapter 3, verse 9 records the phrase, the prayer, the heart posture, the conviction that underlied the king's strength to change. This is what Jonah 3, verse 9 says. He says, who knows? God may turn and relent, and may turn from his fierce anger so that we may not perish. Now, at first, it looks like the king is kind of gambling. It's like, well, we're in trouble anyways. Let's roll the dice. See if we can secure some other outcome. And in particular, maybe God is changing it and fickle, such that if we change, God will change. It's easy to read this text this way. And of course, whenever we come up against instances in the Bible where God is changing or changing his mind, we're always very tempted to be like, see, I told you, God's changing. God's changing his mind all the time. He's unreliable. But of course, why would the king think in the first place that if he changes that God will relent? It's not because he thinks that God is a fickle God. It's because he thinks that God is a reliable God with a reliable character. In other words, the king's power to change comes from his belief that there is something unchanging in the situation, namely the merciful character of the God of the Bible. And armed with the power that there is something unchanging in his moment of change, he's able to get up and say, I might undergo some change, but there is something stable in this situation, regardless of what is changing for me. It's the stability of the merciful character of God. And indeed, in Exodus chapter 34, verse 6, the primary mountaintop experience of the revelation of God's character in the Old Testament, the text says this: the Lord, the compassionate and gracious God, slow to anger, abounding in love and faithfulness. The ESV renders that the merciful and gracious God. The king of Nineveh draws strength to change from his belief that God's character will remain the same in this situation, not that God's character will be changing. We can change in our lives because God is unchanging. The unchanging nature and character of God is itself power and stability for us to change. We just follow this with me, okay? We hate change because it's destabilizing and full of uncertainty. And so in this uncertain, chaotic, random world, we will continue to endure change in our lives, and it will almost certainly be scary and painful. But heaven is not like this world. And the God of heaven is not full of the same chaos and randomness and capriciousness that characterizes this world. The God of heaven is the same yesterday, today, and tomorrow. And our instances of change become things that prove the way that God does not change. And you would have courage and strength in your moments of change if you knew that when you changed, there would be something that stayed the same anyway, and that would be God's presence in your life. God's purpose in your life. If you changed in your moments of change and struggle and trial, if you knew that God's grace would be the same, if you knew that God's justice would prove to be the same, if you knew that God's mercy would be the same, if you knew that God's presence with you would be the same, if you knew that when you changed, God would prove to be the same, that would be power for you to change. Because change would no longer be about all the randomness and capriciousness. It would be about the way that God is being revealed to be the same all the time. That would be strength for you to change, and to change by yourself. To change on your own when nobody's going with you, because the sameness of the God of the Bible is going with you. The sameness of the God of the Bible is revealed most clearly in the revelation of God's Son, Jesus Christ. Because when Jesus stood up on a high mountain to proclaim the Sermon on the Mount, he showed that he was the same God who gave the law to Moses on the high mountain of Mount Sinai. And when Jesus came to heal Gentiles and widows, he showed that he was the same God who healed Gentiles and widows in the ministry of Elijah in the days of the kings of Israel. And when he came to seek the lost and the far away, he showed that he was the same God who sought his people in exile when they were lost and far away. And when he made Jesus king and raised him up onto the throne of Israel, he showed that he was the same God who promised to David that he would never leave his throne without an heir. And when Jesus gave himself up to die, he showed that he was the same God who promised before by the prophets that he would give himself up and hand himself over to violent men so that we could be saved and healed from our sins. The God who is revealed in Jesus is the same yesterday and today, beginning and end, Alpha and Omega. He is the same. And when you believe in your moments of change, not just generally, vaguely out there, but in your experience of your change in your life and changes you need to make, when you believe that God is unchanging in those places where you need to change, that becomes spiritual power put into you by faith to change, knowing that your change will reveal that God is the same. I don't know what change you're going through today. I don't know how urgent your changes are. But some of us are in different places about that today. Some of us have things where we're like, yeah, that's becoming more pressing. Some of us are in places where we're like, yeah, the clock is ticking. I need to change. And you've looked around and said, there's no strength anywhere to change. No one's going with me. I've marshaled up my own will as much as I can. If that's you, you need to believe today that in that place of change, God will prove to be the same. When the God of the Bible, when we receive him by faith, the God of the Bible is unchanging in our places of change, that becomes courage and boldness in our places of change, because we know that our changing will reveal that God is the same. And when we receive that by faith, it's power in our lives to change, and to change on our own, to change by ourselves when we have to, and to grow up. To grow up with God and to change when we need to, because we know that God will prove to stay the same. Amen.